All right. So happy reunions weekend, everyone. My name is Trinae Hawkins, and I'm a member of the great class of 2006 and vice president of ABPA. Each February, ABPA, as well as many in our Black alumni community, use the occasion of Black History Month to honor our ancestors. This year, ABPA decided to try something a little different, and we honored our living alumni who are making Black history now. So I'm thrilled to help ABPA kick off our reunions weekend celebration with a panel featuring this year's ABPA Living Legends honorees. This panel includes Black alumni spanning 5 decades and making their mark on the world and in our communities across a range of disciplines, from law to the classics to social impact and justice. The panel will be moderated by one of our newest alumni, Morgan Smith, class of 2021, bringing 6 generations of Black Princetonians together for a conversation that you surely won't forget. Morgan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Trinae. It's a pleasure to be here. When I first heard about the opportunity for this panel, I immediately jumped at it, and what really inspired me to think about was a quote by James Baldwin, which says, "If you know once you came, there is really no limit to where you can go." And so, thinking of the decades of Princetonians that are here with us, we're truly in the presence of stories, insight, and wisdom to guide us. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. Today, we will be joined by our Living Legend honorees, Vera Marcus, class of 72, attorney, Roy Swan, class of 86, of Leader in Impact Investing, anthropologist, writer, and creative guide Celeste Henry, class of 99, our very own professor of classics, Professor Danielle Padilla Peralta, class of '06. And last, but certainly not least, JD and former editor in chief of the Columbia Law Review, Tumiche Asimbion. And so, as we get into our first question, first, I want to ask of our panelists, inspired by the Living Legends series and how we thoughtfully tell our own stories, especially in relation to Princeton, when someone asks, what was it like going to Princeton? How does your being Black complicate this question and your alumni experience as you moved forward from Princeton? Maybe if we can have Miss Marcus go first.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you. Okay, first, I just want to acknowledge the women who came by transfer to Princeton before me. And I want to acknowledge my smart and beautiful 11 Black sisters who together entered Princeton with me in 1969. We were a group, and they too are here with me and supporting me today. To understand my experience at Princeton, one has to really understand where I came from. I was a very poor Black girl from Alabama whose siblings would later include a doctor, a nurse, a mathematics college professor, a social worker, a civil rights worker, and a deaf mute who held a job, drove a car, and had a family. Failure didn't exist in my world. My sister Pat and I had been a part of the great experiment to integrate Alabama's racially segregated schools. My father had met with Dr. Martin Luther King, and there's an iconic picture of my sister sitting all alone in a classroom at her formerly all-white high school in 1963 because all of the white students were boycotting. It was strangely exciting and dangerous as my father walked our street at night to protect us with a shotgun after the church bombings. I had so little knowledge of Princeton before going there that I didn't really know that Princeton was an all-male school. This was further complicated by being Black. I quickly learned that if there was no Black version of what I wanted to do at Princeton, I had to create it. So being Black always meant that you had to work a little harder. I had a passion for theater, and I joined Theater On Team doing plays at McCarter and Triangle Club. I sought out the Black theater community at Princeton and participated in Harambee House. Coming from Alabama, where there was no Black theater, I thought I was in heaven. Princeton students actually spoke to me, sang beside me, and danced with me. All of this experience led to me founding a Black Fire Theater company. And they did marvelous things across the South and the eastern portions of the United States. Eventually, my eclectic career had me working for Governor Brown, overseeing the first solar handbook in the United States and heading a legislative effort for the passage of $77 million for natural resources, and heading the Wild Rivers Task Force, cementing federal protections that will last forever for these California wild rivers. Still, my Blackness made a difference. The head of the Smith River Alliance called Huey Johnson, who was a cabinet secretary, and said, "Why did you have to send a Black, let me quote it, we're already having enough trouble with the rivers. Why did you have to send a Black woman up here on top of everything else?" Princeton was a finishing school, I think, that prepared me for leadership.
Thank you for that answer. And if we can have Mr. Swanga.
Hi, everyone. Yes. Oh my goodness, that was just such a moving. Can you all hear me? Okay. You should not. Okay, great. I am driving to my daughter's track meet in a tunnel of all things, like right at this very moment. So hopefully won't lose me. So thank you so much for first of all those inspiring words we just heard, and for having me here. I realize I'm just symbolic of the many living legends in my class and the 80s. So I'll say, many of us have this same story. I come from a low income area where white people calling Black people the N word was not unusual. And so I'd say when I was at Princeton, I don't think it was so much the racial dynamic that felt unusual. What was different was the combination of being Black and relatively poor and being completely unprepared academically. So I quickly learned that being at the top of my high school class didn't mean much when I was in the tall cotton at Princeton. So that was a bit of a shake. It was also the first time I had been what I'd call harassed by police officers. That didn't happen much in my town. I mean, so that was a bit of a thing. But being a part of the track team was a community. And I would say more than anything else, the friends that I made during the summer program, there's a program, I don't know if they still have it, but about a month before school started, they had this program with mostly Black and brown kids, just to get us acclimated to the Princeton environment. I made so many friends during that period that I still have to today. That was a big part of my survival at the school. So I'll stop there and turn it back over.
Thank you. And Ms. Henry?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And it's an honor and pleasure to be with all of you today. My experience at Princeton, I'm the product of went to boarding school, and I feel like the story begins there with parents who value education. And so I became the kind of prep school kid who went to Princeton. I don't think I would have wound up at Princeton without that formative experience. And coming to Princeton, on the one hand, out of boarding school, prepped me for the academic load and somewhat of the social mode, which was being in a predominantly white institution. I think, sort of as Roy said, I'm a working class kid. And so coming to Princeton for me was an experience in terms of my Blackness was a lot about class difference. And it was a point where I experienced Black wealth that was new to me. And so I think it's taken that trajectory till now to kind of make sense of it. I also got into anthropology, and which at that point had no Black professors. There was nothing really related to Black folks in the department. And so my journey took me to Latin America, which was sort of a passion. And it was through that I got into African diaspora studies. And so one of the ways that I think about my time at Princeton was not only a period where my curiosity was fed and my opportunities were given left and right, and took me around the world, which was a huge gift. And I feel like now, as an anthropologist who works with Black descended populations on questions of race, gender, and social inequality, it's been an opportunity to now go back in time to make sense of my experience, both at Princeton and earlier, and to kind of reinvest that back into Black communities. I worked in Brazil and here in Texas, specifically around our massive problem of incarceration that we're all contending with right now. So I'll leave it at that.
And Professor Peralta?
Hi, folks. I want to start by thanking all of you for being here and expressing my admiration to all my fellow living legends and to all my predecessors and ancestors who made it possible for me to be here today. So, like Celeste, I arrived at Princeton having gone to a prep school. I went to a prep school in New York City. And one of the things I quickly discovered was that the kinds of euphemistic language that in these sort of like putatively liberal environments in New York City, folks used to cast aspersions at me was really stripped naked at first, because people would say things and you would realize that they were coming at you, but you'd always be taken aback by the bluntness of some of it. So I'll give one illustration and then I'll turn to an experience that was for me very formative in providing me with a bulwark and a sense of resistance against these incidents. So when I was back at Princeton after my first year of undergrad, when I was back home in Harlem, I got a letter from the office of the dean of the college informing me that I'd won this academic award. And I was floored. Initially, I didn't really believe it, but I was so hyped. I was excited. The university said that I could bring my family to opening exercises. I was just over the moon. When I got back to campus that fall, there were a lot of people who would come up to me, some of my classmates, when I was eating at Frisk Campus Center, and they would start asking me questions about this award. And they'd ask, how'd you win this award? And I was like, well, I did well in my classes, like that's how I won this award. And they would be like, no, but like really, like, how did you win this award? And then so I realized that there were a lot of folks for whom the idea of an Afro-Caribbean dude winning this academic award was like utterly alien. Like they could not countenance the fact that I had won this, let alone that I might have like a valid claim on this award, or that other folks like me might have a valid claim on this award. But in the midst of that and many other experiences that served to cement my own othering on this campus as an undergrad, I had the good fortune of being surrounded by a community that deeply cared for me, other Black students. Before we started today's event, Trenae was reminiscing with me about a reminder she got on Facebook last time she signed on Facebook. It was a photo from the Men's Appreciation Dinner that was hosted for Black men in the spring of 2006. And here is an email from Trenae written to me and several of us who were really, really late RSVPing for this dinner. Hey guys, so I'm trying to make sure that my 06 men are well taken care of this year for the Men's Appreciation Dinner. But in order to do that, I have to know if y'all are coming. So please reply to this email. What this email serves to underline for me was the incredible amount of care that was bestowed on us by folks in our community, especially Black women in our community, who were trying to look out for us as we tried to look out for them. And had it not been for those experiences, I do not think I would have survived Princeton. It was indispensable to my own well-being that I felt always, even in the midst of these profoundly estranging experiences, a sense of a community dedicated to the proposition of care and to the care of fellow Black folks. So I'll leave you with that.
And Ms. Acevedo, sorry.
Thanks, Morgan. And feel free to call me Tumiche. Thank you all for joining. It's super exciting to be in community, even though we're virtual. And to the question of, what do I think about when I'm looking back at my Princeton experience? I think it was so central to me that I was able to actually explore my identity and the spaces I inhabited beyond my race. And I say this because, like Vera, I grew up in the South. I grew up in a rural town in Southern Georgia where, as a child of Nigerian immigrants and as a child of educated Black people as well, I was always looked at kind of sideways, right? So kind of this whole idea of, can you be Black and smart? Can you be Black and educated? Can you be Black and a professional? And my experience in school was a difficult one. I do not have any fond memories of my years in high school. And my parents always emphasized that I shouldn't be bitter, right? So coming to Princeton was an opportunity to experience my Blackness, but also an opportunity to experience my intellectual life, to develop relationships, to find people who are also at the intersection of identities. And, not to say that race or race-related issues are not present on campus, but it was nice for that to not always be the starting point or the most present point of interaction. So I look back to Princeton, I think to my friendships a lot. I think to the girlfriends I made, my Black girlfriends, my girlfriends who are not Black, and having just graduated from Columbia Law School, I also think to the alumni network, right? There was a Black woman in my class at Princeton who graduated Columbia the year I was starting, and it was just a reminder that Princeton people are everywhere. Princeton Black people, there, I think this past year, I think there are like 5 or 6 of us from Princeton who are 1Ls to 3Ls, most of who I knew on campus or maybe saw in passing. And it's like, oh, you're at Columbia Law School, fantastic, coffee, let's chat, let's support one another. So I think about the alumni network, and I've grown to appreciate it, I think, now that I'm outside of Princeton, and not just for all the reasons that we talk about the alumni network being great, but it's like people who can give you advice, people who give you insight. We've talked about those who have gone before us. And kind of having that obligation, but also enjoying the obligation of working to continuously bring ourselves together as Princetonians, but to also lift ourselves up. I think similar to what Celeste said, I think my Blackness at Princeton also, again, was an intersectional one where seeing the different socioeconomic experiences and backgrounds that people were coming from probably stood out to me more than my race. And maybe that's because of the diversity of the student body. Maybe it's because of Princeton as an institution and how certain things may be normalized or seen as run of the mill, but very new to a few of us, notwithstanding whatever background we came from. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for those amazing answers. And so now that you all are outside of the institution, what brings you back to Princeton, whether it be work, student alumni engagement, or reunions?
Well, in the same order, right? I think that the Black alumni from 1968 and forward brought me back to Princeton. I've recently been joined in weekly conversations that we had. They're very comfortable, extremely supportive. Any projects that we're working on, we share about. If we can help, we help. And it's really changed my life to have these weekly discussions after having been absent from Princeton for all of the 50 years and having not been back to Princeton even once. And I'm planning next year to come back for my first time. I'm just really proud and honored to be among these Black proud Princetonians that I've been meeting with, and I tip my hat to them. And I have maintained one friendship, and that's with my friend Deanna Tolliver. And I want to mention it because we've managed to stay friends for 50 years, and that's really hard with my personality. I thought that I was the only one who left Princeton and never looked back, but and I also came back, I think, in part from meeting a woman named Daryl. She's over the class of 72 women's issues, and she reached out to me. So that's basically what's brought me back in recent months to um, feel and appreciate the benefits of that education.
And we can feel free to go in order or as
Yeah.
you all feel inspired. But Mr. Swan?
Yeah, well, I have been back to campus a few times. Mostly, I think I've been back twice for parts of the Thrive event, which I just think is such a great opportunity to see old friends and so forth. But otherwise, I haven't spent a lot of time back. I was invited once or twice over the years by um, the president's office for some events, which I don't even remember what they were. But I will say at this point that I would love to come back. If students, if there were evenings where folks could come in and just chat informally, you know, I welcome invitations to come back to campus. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the next person.
Celeste?
Well, I'm feeling comforted because I've only been back once, and I've made my home here in Texas for the last 20 years. And so, not that it's impossible to get on a flight, but I came back in the context of an academic environment and or a conference. And so that was fascinating to see what had changed and whatnot. I've stayed a part of the alumni network here at various points, but in general, I think of my connection to the university, and it's kind of my sense of greater community has been through one, financially giving back, but also just taking what I learned there. I think the gifts again of opportunity and kind of curiosity and funneling it into to people, and particularly Black folks, wherever I find myself. So that's been here in Texas, and questions related to Black folks. But I will also add that one of the things that has brought me back to the universities, I'm at the University of Texas at Austin in a research capacity, and working on questions related to the university's history. And that's brought me full circle back to, of course, these questions about our institution and its relation to slavery. And of course, my interest in universities being in the post-slavery, you know, kind of Jim Crow, and what kind of context that was for institutions since slavery. And so looking at the old folks, the first generations that came in here at UT has made me really appreciative, Ms. Marcus, to see folks like you and to hear your stories and to know who opened these doors for us, whose footsteps we walk in, and can only imagine really what that's like given the complexities of today, and certainly when I was there at Princeton. So thank you, and thanks for any of the other of our forerunners who might be on this Zoom meeting.
So I'm still here. So I have not left. No, I did leave. So after graduating Princeton in 2006, I did graduate work first in the UK and then on the West Coast. And then my first job was at Columbia. But throughout the journey outside of Princeton, I did keep circling back. One of the motivations was that I am very close to some of my 06 classmates, and We have text threads, most of the time dedicated to various forms of clowning, but occasionally very focused on serious issues bearing on our own individual and collective relationships to the university. We had a text thread going the other day during a reunions panel, and the responses of some of my classmates when one of my co-panelists said that Woodrow Wilson was not that bad a racist. They're the reason why I live for text threads. That's what this is all for. More to the point, one of the issues that has been at the center of my own renegotiation of relationships within the university and beyond has been one that Celeste flagged in her work. I'm very interested in Princeton's history and in the living legacies of settler colonialist violence and the transatlantic slave trade right here on this campus. So one of the things that I tried to do not too long ago for an event pitched to undergrads as part of winter session in January was to speak briefly about an endowed chair, because it's all about money at the end. And there's an endowed chair in my department that is named after Charles Ewing, who was a New Jersey judge who gets a write-up in the Princeton Slavery Project. But this chair was funded by a guy who made his wealth off the opium trade. So this was a 19th century benefactor to the university whose resources funneled through drugs were instrumental in the physical architecture and in the intellectual history of this university. So one of the points I tried to underscore for folks is, imagine if, for those of you who've watched The Wire, we had a Barksdale Hall or Barksdale endowed chair. Like what does it mean to think about the relationships between various forms of structural violence that radiate outward and define the relationship of the United States to the entire world and this university, like right here, right now. And it's that intensifying engagement with questions of institutional history that has been central to renegotiating my own place here at the university.
So I think after Morgan, I'm the most recent graduate. I'm 5 years out from Princeton, so I've certainly been around campus, in part because I had friends who were still in school. I live in New York, so it's a train ride away. Right now, my cousin just finished his junior year, so I have the people. I think he's the last person I know who's a student. But the proximity to New York and my friendships and my girlfriends who are in New York, and knowing that we have that second home or place that's so familiar, I think is what's brought me back to campus. Very easy if it's just for lunch or dinner. My freshman year roommate's family lives in Princeton, so I visit her. And in a way, it's an escape from the city when I need it. It's a place where I did find a lot of comfort and I did find my place. So going back to campus and spending time in Princeton is something that's easily accessible for me, I would say. I think the other thing too that's kept me connected to Princeton, both physically on campus, but even the network, are some of my friends who are involved in our class leadership. Yeah, I did annual giving when I was at Princeton and in my first few years out, and just kind of staying interconnected with those who are actively involved in Princeton and making sure that we're doing it in a way that serves us and represents our interest in like our relationship to the university, right? An example of that, I was invited to a conversation with a group of alum and administrators, and we had this conversation. I had some feedback afterward, and it's like, insofar as I'm going to be an alumni who's engaged and a Black woman who's called upon to join conversations, I'll also tell you where I think you could grow or where we could work toward a different type of future, and to just be very pointed and realistic, I think, in my interactions, because all of us here do have a stake in the university and we do have a voice. And so that's something that I've started to explore more recently, I would say.
Thank you for those answers. And I have two more questions for our panelists, and then we will transition to questions from the community. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And so for my second to last question, I wanted to ask our panelists, I know that you all have pursuits, and I wanted to ask about how you developed your motivation for those pursuits and where your connection to Princeton as an alumna ties in to the work that you currently do.
I admit to a bit of social isolation at Princeton. I don't know if I felt it at the time, but looking back, I know it had to have been there. But now I'm a family lawyer with an eye into many people's homes, their traumas, their dysfunctions, their despair. So on a daily basis, I have to decide whether I'm an ambassador for peace for these people or a pallbearer. Um, After my family, of course, Princeton motivated me for this job by sending me the message that I can do anything, but I can't complain. I can't make excuses. I just have to do it. And some days I want to call a lawyer. Then I remember that I am the lawyer with this tremendous power to direct people's lives after divorce. But having gone to Princeton, everything I approach knowing that I can handle it.
So the great thing about Princeton, uh, as relates to my pursuit, is I think it's largely because of Princeton that I became a failed pre-med. My dream from the time I was a young teen, I wanted to have a job where my work was helping others. And the thing about Princeton, I just got rocked academically, and the whole pre-med thing, I stuck with it, but it ultimately ended up being a bit of a disaster. I thought I'd work for a few years and return, maybe do a post baccalaureate program. I started studying for MCAT, et cetera. But what happened was it was a blessing in disguise, because the job I have now and some of the jobs I've had in my life, I have been able to do exactly what I've wanted to do, and that is to help people. The difference is, as a doctor, it would have been one-on-one impact. Instead, because the jobs I've had have entrusted significant pools of capital that I can invest, I'm able to help people at scale. So so Princeton was a pathway to one failure to me, but that failure ended up being the greatest opportunity to fulfill my dream. And I will tell you that it's not just Princeton that motivates my pursuits, as that's kind of an obvious point. But the other thing I will say is that my religious background and the idea that to whom much is given, much is expected, and much is a relative term. From as the folks people would say in my old church, boy, you've come from a mighty long way, and I'm thankful to have the opportunity to help others through my job. So I'll stop there and turn it over.
And I'll say I was also an athlete at Princeton and played water polo. And so I think because academics were what brought me to Princeton, but I also water polo went varsity when I was there. So it became a serious demand as well. But I think those two experiences, one, I didn't spend a lot of time on campus because I was traveling for competitions. And then summers I spent, because of my interest in anthropology, I spent in other parts of the world. And I think those two have fused together in a way of kind of having what I call a portfolio life, of doing of knowing that I can do a bunch of different things at once, and I don't have to follow a traditional career, which hasn't been easy by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think I've had conversations with friends who are alumni from Princeton, and one of the things I think we've shared in is a conversation of the university is not particularly good at counseling people like ourselves who have a variety of interests and how to move forward. So that's been a process of self-education. I loved your term, Miss Marcus, about your personality. I would say that in general, I'm not a long-term planner, even though I'm, disciplined in all these other things. And so life has been much of an unfolding and an embracing of kind of the unknown. All of that's a long way to say that my next step out of Princeton was one, trying to figure out, what am I going to do next? And without Princeton, I wouldn't have gone to graduate school. And that was the next step that enabled me to go explore the world, get a PhD in anthropology. And it wasn't with the objective of becoming a professor. And so I think looping back to the education that I received is that I was able to make it my own. Nobody told me I had to do one particular thing, which I was grateful for, plus all of the opportunities I was given financially and incentive-wise. Just the idea of possibility was so incredible. And so that's sort of what's moved me forward. And in turn, what I try to offer to other people, no matter their circumstances, not unrealistically, but to carry that kind of spirit that the world is open and to try to move in whatever capacity, to take life as it comes, to be curious. And those are definitely things, this trajectory, I would link back to my experience at Princeton. So.
There were two things I learned at Princeton that proved foundational in steering me on my pursuits, and that are with me now. They leave their mark on practically everything I do. The first thing I learned was that I had to resist some of the taxonomies of this place. So on arrival as a first-year student in the fall of 2002, I gravitated to folks who had backgrounds similar to mine. But I realized that for the university's gaze, there was a kind of United States of Benetton style approach to like really collecting all the Black and brown people. And this persists even as the university mounts a determined effort at broadening its commitment to equity and diversity. There's still a sense that the prevailing logic is one of addition. Just rack them up. Without any sustained consideration of the structural features of the university that might make it hostile to folks of color, right? Like, what would you have to do in order to take this predominantly white institution and steer it into a space of genuine welcome, support, and solidarity for the project of racial justice? This is an unanswered question. It's one that the university has to confront, but it was thanks in no small part to my classmates and to some of my friends at undergrad that I even became alert to the benefits of posing this question in the first place. The second thing I learned, and the one that has really stuck to me like glue in recent years, is that I have to always prepare myself for the imperative of delivering criticism and critique. This means that, as Sarah Ahmed and others have written, you're going to be looked at as kind of a killjoy. And this is particularly true in contexts like reunions, for example. Like we all here to celebrate. We all here to lift up people in our community. Who's that critical voice? Who's that carping voice? Why are they complaining? Why are the Black and brown people complaining still? But the imperative to complain is one that has to be embraced. And it's one that often will get you looked at sideways here, especially if you occupy any sort of institutional niche on campus, partly because folks feel it tiresome or believe it to be counterproductive for the purposes of spinning a positive, upbeat story about the university if you engage in critique. but critique is necessary for the work of advancing the institution, if the university is ever to advance in the directions to which we've pledged ourselves. And it's that commitment, which was in very rough shape when I was an undergrad, that has been honored most faithfully and insistently by the work of student activists over the past few decades. It's a legacy that's carried up by our class of 2021 moderator right here. And it's to that lesson that I apply myself in my pursuits in all walks, including those that have little to no direct intersection with Princeton at all.
What motivates my pursuits now, and in part because I just finished law school, but more broadly, my interests are really the life of my mind and giving space for intellectual curiosity and development. So even going into law school, I very much was like, I may practice law, I may not, but I'm very interested in that thought exercise and the intellectual exercise that is learning and thinking about big problems and thinking about them in ways that hopefully can drive us toward more direct solutions. And that certainly came from my time at Princeton. I had a friend who graduated 2 years before me who quipped that people who go to Princeton do well at law school, but specifically Columbia Law School. And it's funny because my first semester of my first year at Columbia, I was like, this feels accessible, right? It feels accessible because when I was a politics major at Princeton, I was given extremely large volumes of reading, extremely critical questions to address, the junior papers, the thesis, and that actual training of how to move through content, move through material, read it, analyze it, add your own opinions, takeaways, thoughts, and discuss, I think was just so clear to me when I started at Columbia. And I had, my friend Megan, who was my class at Princeton, sat me down first week of class and was like, okay, listen, you are prepared and you're ready to do this. And I was like, pep talk from a friend, but then living through that experience, and it was something I made sure to pass on to other Black Princetonians who came to Columbia because I did feel very academically prepared. I think the other thing too is, for better or for worse, being at such an elite, prestigious institution like Princeton, where I kind of questioned my intellect for those 4 years up until senior spring, and really saw privilege and saw wealth and saw what being in a space like Princeton could do for you. I wasn't questioning that when I got to Columbia. And I think it was something that I sometimes saw in my classmates, where I promised myself I wasn't going to question my presence at Columbia. I wasn't going to question my intellect or my value add, because I already spent 4 years doing that at Princeton. And so if anything, now I was going to go forward in confidence. Again, for better or for worse, I don't know that difficult experiences or being in an incredibly challenging space, both academically and socially, should be praised and supported. But in a world like ours, and if we're taking a very practical view, I was able to move along quickly and find my space at Columbia and all of that. And now that I'm outside of the academic environment, I think, and I worked before law school, I think I'm still kind of curious to work through and to think about, how am I going to apply myself? How am I going to apply the leverage that Princeton gave me? That was something I thought about a lot when I was working at an investment bank after graduation, and just continues to show up, right? Because those who have power, those who make decisions, those who are doing very important and critical things that impact people beyond them, it takes leverage to get there, right? And I recognize the leverage that I have, and I don't want to take that for granted. I want to use that to my advantage, but using that to my advantage is for a broader cause beyond me. And now more than ever, I think it's just super critical to think about that, to think beyond ourselves, especially as a Black woman in 2021 America. We just can't take the positions we're afforded for granted.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for answering my questions. And we will now move on to the audience Q&A. We have some great questions from our audience. And so the first question is for you, Ms. Marcus. What compelled you to stay away from and its unions and conferences that sought to include people like you for over 50 years?
First of all, I had no practice. High school is where you practice, joining sororities, being a member of the band. Um, I was even denied the valedictorian honor at my school, although I had the highest average. So I had no practice with the social institutions um, and norms of being a part of an academic community. So it was more natural for me when I left Princeton not to look back, because when I left high school, there was nothing for me to look back to. Also, I think underlying this entire panel, underlying everything that I've been involved with at Princeton, is the silent issue of the day, which was Black people weren't accepted. And even though we had been admitted to Princeton, we were not really accepted into the eating clubs and the social structure. And in your little body, you know when you're not fully accepted, but we don't want to talk about it because that's a negative part of being at Princeton. But I decided to embrace it all because I helped, and all of the women with me and the men students who are Black helped to make Princeton what it is. So we should take all from it that we can to go out and help others in the world.
Thank you. And for our younger alums, so Celeste, Professor Peralta, Tumiche, how would you appraise the racial attitudes of the faculty? Were you welcomed? Have you cultivated long-term relationships with them as mentors?
I was in the politics department, and oh gosh, I loved my major. I loved my major. I loved the classes, and I think I was really fortunate to work with women of color on my independent research. So my junior paper was advised by LaFleur Stevens-Dugan, who at the time was her first year teaching at Princeton. She's a Black woman. Incredible work she does, and she was just fantastic to work with. I text her now still, and she's like, call me LaFleur, and I'm like, I could never do that, Professor Stevens. So I had the great fortune of also being introduced to my concentration from the perspective of a Black woman who specialized in work on race and politics and colorism, and this is all around the Obama election or coming out of that, right? Coming out of the Obama presidency, excuse me. And then for my second junior paper and my senior thesis, I worked with Professor Amani Jamal, again, incredible powerhouse woman, so well known and renowned in her field, and just wonderful. And I think because I had them so present in my time at Princeton, I was able to appreciate my studies and what I specifically was interested in a lot more than I think my peers or people on average could. And I stay in touch with both of them now, and I know that this experience may not be the most representative, but I think it was something I'm very fortunate to have, and I can appreciate even now. I can appreciate even more now, right? Coming out of Columbia, I had one Black female professor. I think there are 2 or 3 at the whole law school, right? So I have positive feelings, but I think it makes me all the more aware of what it's like to be at the front of the classroom, or to see someone at the front of the classroom and to know that they appreciate where you're coming from, or come with other assumptions and understandings of life that are often taken for granted in these academic spaces that are so critical, not only for intellectual development, but how people are socialized.
Understood. And so for Mr. Swan and Ms. Henry, balancing athletics, academics, and the social environment at Princeton, how did that shape you into the leader that you are today?
I'll let Celeste go ahead.
I was hoping you'd talk first, Roy.
I'm happy to go real quick. So the track team, between the track team and the summer program, and then I'll throw in Thurl World Center. It's got a different name now. Those were the keys to my survival. I was ready to drop out of Princeton several times, but I had those friendships, particularly those friendships forged during the 1 month summer program. I think I saw Mike Barney. It might be on this call, but Mike was one of the leaders in that program, and so without that, it would have been, particularly the first couple of years, would have been a really, really tough time for me. I was so culturally out of place, but thank God for those foundations, and they're the sources of my many of my fond memories. I'll stop there. Hand it over to Celeste.
My athletics experience was wonderful insofar as I loved my sport and got a chance to play at the collegiate level. But it's probably no news to most folks that water polo is an extremely white sport. And I'm long since been used to being the only, and a male dominant sport. So that was both a wonderful experience and an experience that I'm still making sense of as the only, without a doubt, person of color, let alone Black person in the pool in many environments. I think there was one other Black swimmer, not swimmer, but water polo player when I was there. And intellectually speaking, I joked about being Clark Kent because I felt like most of my social life came not from my swim team or my water polo colleagues, but I enjoyed the camaraderie in that space and kind of tough girls that were willing to get in the pool and weren't afraid to get physical. I love that. And it just was a different view from being at Princeton. We were a smaller program, so I think we shed a little bit of our elitism in that space because we were just kind of average, but got good. And but then by day, dealing with academics, which was a huge part, that was why I was there. Water polo is the bonus. That was the space where I think I was learning to ask different questions and reverting again to what Ms. Marcus said. I think I've been out for a while now, 20 years. So, but when I was there were, a handful of Black faculty in the humanities. And even in retrospect, I had, mostly male teachers the whole time, professors the whole time. So, and it almost didn't occur to me until coming to grad school, which was my own little mini HBCU experience with all Black faculty, which was tremendous. And so I think I'm still trying to make sense of all of this, but I think the juxtaposition of sports and an intellectual life really fed different parts of me in complex ways. So I'll leave it at that.
And then one last question from our audience to wrap up. Someone asked, one of the biggest sources of support at Princeton were Black workers. DFAS workers, proctors, and athletic equipment guys don't get their due for supporting us. Was this true of your Princeton experience?
I'm trying to remember if I knew any Black staff members back in 69 through 72. And I'm embarrassed about it, but I don't remember any. I don't know if there were fewer on staff, but they didn't have a presence at Princeton for me.
I will say that it was always a welcome moment when when I was in the locker room getting ready for track practice, and it was Hank Towns and a couple other guys, some of the brothers who lived in Princeton that kind of, let me know where, what was happening in the neighborhoods, where was a barbershop, the churches, and so forth. So that was a having those connections, which I hadn't thought about until this very moment. But that was really a moment of comfort and sanctuary when you just had those conversations with folks who I felt a lot more comfortable with socially and culturally. So thanks for that question.
I think when Morgan's question was when Morgan asked her question, my first thought was our dining hall workers and the residential college staff. And I remember Sandy was my freshman spring, and any of the snowstorms, I think me and my Black girlfriends were always like so grateful. This is a bit twisted, quite frankly, that Princeton would make sure that staff was housed on campus or near campus in exigent weather, to make sure that the students were provided for, which was like, it was a good thing, but it was in some ways like painful. Like, why do they have to be here? There are other people that matter to them as well. But I was always grateful for them. And I think it was always that nod, that smile. And the eating club downstairs as well, which I know were technically, I think, hired by the eating clubs themselves, but I think it was always them who recognized me and my friends and knew our names, and were always there to just have that kind word again, that nod, that smile, though we see you, we see what you're doing at this school. It's tough, but we can appreciate that. So very grateful for those presences on campus.
Yeah, to your words just now, I want strongly to emphasize that my own gratitude for the folks who worked in dining services, who were a part of the grounds upkeep, and who were involved in like running the day-to-day operations of the university, was complicated by my own incipient sense, which came into focus really near the end of my undergraduate years, that the university played games of hierarchy that taught me and conditioned me to differentiate myself from these folks, even as I engage in the performance of gratitude, right? So like, to go back to an earlier point, like this was something that I also had to resist. Like, this is like part of the habituation into a specific identity of elite that was, I saw as increasingly inimical to any prospect of building and maintaining meaningful relationships with folks. So when I was returning to Princeton as a member of the faculty, I was having a conversation with my department chair at the time, who's now retired. And I was explaining to him that I was having some difficulties getting a straight answer from folks at the faculty housing office about campus housing arrangements. And he says something I'll never forget, because it goes right to the heart of the many small and not so small discursive gestures by which you're professionalized to think of yourself as somehow different from other folks of color. He said, well, if they're not responding to your emails, just use the whip hand. And I was like, do you understand that you're talking to a Black person? Like, why would you say this? Like, I just could not. But like, it was, as I realized at the time, and I've thought about in the years since, so central to a specific form of self-fashioning on this campus, that for this person, it could somehow escape from view. I mean, of course he was white. I mean, that I would have much more at stake in identifying with folks who are already on the receiving end of structural violence, even though they have, the benefit of working here, than I would with identifying with his exhortation to use the whip hand or whatever. But I stress this only to reiterate that one of the challenges that this university sets in front of Black people, especially students and faculty, is this dialectic of differentiation from the practice of service, which is understood as somehow not professional or second rate or something that you do for or on behalf of what really constitutes the core of this university or whatever. And like this is something to fight against, more so than some of the other points I was making earlier.
I just want to add something. Having listened to the other speakers, the question came into my mind: why aren't Black staffers a presence in my mind. I'll let you all answer that. But I've told you stories of my father and what he did during the civil rights movement. He was also a minister. My father was also a janitor. And so, if confronted, I would always be proud to say that because he had to have multiple jobs to take care of his family. But I say proudly today, my father was also a janitor.
Thank you so much, Ms. Marcus, and to our panelists for such compelling answers. That wraps up our Q&A portion. And before I hand it back to Trinae, I just wanted to thank you all, one, for our panelists for, again, such amazing answers, but to our audience as well for listening in today. So thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. I am just in a space of such deep gratitude. My heart is literally fluttering. So I'm like trying to catch my breath. This was amazing. I'm just so honored we were able to have this conversation this morning. Being on gallery view and being able to flip through and see mentors, mentees, classmates, colleagues, it's just like warms my heart. So again, Trinae Hawkins, 06, ABPA Vice President. We are so grateful to have you all with us today. We hope you are enjoying your reunions weekend and that you'll join us later on today for ABPA's annual awards banquet and celebration. We will do our awards banquet with each of our award winners presenting their speeches in acceptance of this year's awards. And then we'll also have a family reunion to follow. So we hope you'll come back at 3:30 p.m. Eastern to join us. We dropped a link in the chat to register for that event if you haven't already done so. Folks are blowing the chat up, so you might have to scroll up a little bit to get it. I'll drop it back in at the bottom. But we hope you will join us. We hope everyone is staying safe and well. We're just grateful to be in community with you and to be in service